Hey, what's good, tubers? Nannu the Nerd here, and today, I guess I'm supposed to be reviewing Society? I mean, alright, 0 out of 10. Literally unplayable. I mean, can you believe we're still doing state-sanctioned lynchings, violently enforced curfews, and perpetuating capitalism? Hold on, I know this is really unprofessional, but I have to take this. Hold on just one second. What's that? Oh, the movie Society. Well...
Spoiler warning. This is your spoiler warning.
I personally don't give a fuck about spoilers, but if you do, why the hell are you watching a review? You can't have a review until you've had a view first. Everybody knows that. But seriously, even more so than other movies, Society kind of relies on surprising you with its ending, and while I'll do my best to avoid the biggest spoilers until the end, in order to discuss the movie as thoroughly as I would like to, I'm gonna have to go over a lot of the twists and turns of the narrative, so, there's your fair warning. In case you didn't know, I'm a big fan of movies in general, and horror specifically, and both of these kicked some major ass in the 80s. Now, this is because of a lot of complicated factors, but basically the short-lived economic bubbles America and Japan were having at the time meant that a lot of money was thrown at passion projects with limited oversight or a need to turn a short-term profit. And that meant that a lot of real kick-ass, off-the-wall, experimental, and just all-around real shit got made during that time. Speaking of, let's talk a little bit about the production of Society. Shot in a speedy 5 weeks on a budget of about $2 million, 1989's Society really typifies a lot of what I've been talking about here. In spite of, or maybe because of its status as an indie cult classic, Society has a lot to say, and there's a lot that can be said about it. Now, I don't want to be a tease here, but if I had to sum it up in a sentence, Society has kind of a They Live meets The Thing type vibe, and combines two of my favorite things, fun 80s horror and Marxism.
The Central Intelligence Agency, America's premier foreign intelligence agency. For more than 60 years, the CIA has been at the forefront of securing the United States.
Society was the directorial debut of Brian Usna, who previously found success as a writer/producer for some classic Lovecraftian horror flicks. Through what I can only assume was underestimating the potential success of Reanimator on the part of Empire International Pictures, Usna had obtained exclusive rights to produce a sequel, and like the absolute legend he is, used this leverage to get the ball rolling on his own original movie. And I gotta say, cucking the studio execs like that, what a fucking baller move, man. Anyway, Society began as a loose concept, inspired by the likes of The Spiral Staircase and Rosemary's Baby. Usna, you see, wanted to make a horror film with a surreal, paranoid tone, and had come up with some ideas for some ambitious practical effects that he'd like to incorporate in such a production. The plot was actually something of an afterthought, with the specifics of the narrative sort of jury-rigged around the tone and special effects. You see, at first, this project was going to be called The Men, and would have been based on a story he was developing with Dan O'Bannon, who was something of a science fiction and horror legend in his own right. Rest in peace, my man. Now, there's not a lot of information about this online, but from what I could tell, The Men would have had that surreal, paranoid horror vibe that Usna was looking for, with a plot that implied that all the men in this particular town were some sort of sinister space invaders. But for some reason, the project died early into production, and as far as I can tell, there wasn't even a script written for it. But all was not lost, as Usna soon got his hands on a speculative script written by Rick Fry and Woody Keith that had a lot of the same thematic beats, and after some revisions, the project was in full swing. Alright, I think you've got enough background info for the context of this film, so with all of that out of the way, I invite you to join me as I take a deep dive into Society itself. The movie opens with some creepy humming, which is a horror staple, along with a couple of production credits. So, I've got to nerd out on you for a little bit here. Yeah, I know, big shocker. But seriously, as someone who does a lot of graphic design, typography, and video editing type work, I fucking love this old school style of white text that kind of lights up and then fades to red. Classic. This epic mullet-sporting sweaty boy here is our protagonist, William, Billy, or Bill, Whitney, played by Billy Warlock, which, I just gotta say, is one of the most badass names I've ever heard. Fun fact, this scene actually wasn't in the original script, but during rewrites, the team decided that they needed some spooky shit to kind of establish the tone, and hence we have this opening scene, which will foreshadow some of the horrors to come. Hell, even more than foreshadowing, it's almost a shot-for-shot copy of a scene that'll occur later on. Now, personally, I probably would have skipped this bit here, but then again, on the other hand, this scene, when taken in conjunction with other scenes later, establishes Billy as a possible That's not even a word, as a possible unreliable narrator, which helps the sense of dread and suspicion the movie is going for. And purely in terms of establishing that paranoid tone we were talking about earlier, you could argue that this was the better way to start the movie. Anywho, this scene is brought to a close with an interruption from Billy's mother, Nan,
Bill?
played by Concetta de Agnes? How do you say that name? Holy fuck. Concetta Denghisi, who my fellow nerds might recognize as Toya from Season 1, Episode 17 of Star Trek The Next Generation. We then cut to Billy talking it over with his psychiatrist, Dr. Cleveland, and like the previous scene, this therapy session, and the others that follow, weren't actually in the original script either, but were added to help strengthen the narrative, and honestly, I think that was the right choice to make.
I get scared.
Of what?
My parents, my sister, you.
Anyway, it's in this scene that we get our first real practical effect and minor scare of the movie with this bit, or should I say bite, with the worms in the apple here. And I gotta say, it works really well thematically and tonally. Very spoop, much symbolism. So wow. But am I the only one around here who is getting kind of a Wallace Shawn type vibe from this guy?
Inconceivable!
After Billy's first scene with Dr. Cleveland, we get the opening title sequence, which both works and doesn't work for me.
We're gonna win so much, you may even get tired of winning, and you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore.
The creepy song choice here is great, and even if you don't get the reference, the way in which it's presented is enough to make it work. But when you get the reference, it elevates this choice from emotionally appropriate to inspired social commentary. You see, the music here is a slight reimagining of the Eton boating song from the private all-male Eton boarding school in England, which costs over $300,000 in tuition to attend, and boasts such diverse and prestigious alumni as the necrophiliac zoophile David Cameron, famous socialist and anti-fascist writer George Orwell, and the embarrassingly pusillanimous anti-Semitic proto-fascist beta bitch boy Boris Johnson. Oh, and fun fact, the student clubs at Eton are called societies. Oh man, that's just too good. While the music is great, the accompanying visuals are a little spoilery. Now, I'm sure this was less of an issue for people who caught it on standard definition VHS back in the day, but the version I saw was the 2K 16-bit restored version done for the 2015 Blu-ray re-release. And while they did do a wonderful job on the restoration, they might have actually done a little bit too good of a job, as watching this ultra-high definition edition, try saying that 10 times fast, can rob some of the practical effects of their mystery and impact, but I'll save the more spoilery examples till the end. After the opening credits, we transition to Billy and his best bro Milo shooting some hoops. Who likes short shorts? We like short shorts. But anyway, while they're out balling, the boys engage in a little bit of banter.
Is that confidence or what? Matter of good breeding, Milo?
Good breeding is a euphemism for incest, changed my mind. Which culminates in Milo saying this.
Yeah, you're Mr. Perfect. You'll probably end up assassinating the president.
This joke confused me at first, so I ended up doing a ton of research on presidential assassinations and assassination attempts in order to figure out what the hell Milo was on about, and while I'm still not entirely sure, the most probable explanation to me is that he's referencing John Hinckley Jr., who, I mean, let's be honest, did something truly awful. Attempting to assassinate Ronald Reagan. Now, I don't want to get too off track here, but can we talk a little bit about the fallout from that attack for a second? Because holy shit, was that wild. While no one died as a result of Hinckley's actions, Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, caught a bullet in the attack and suffered permanent disability. Following this, James and his wife Sarah became gun control advocates who eventually got the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, also known as the Brady Bill, passed some 10 years later. The Brady Bill, by the way, requires a shallow background check for certain types of specific firearm sales, and credit where credit is due because they had to deal with years of abuse from friends and fellow Republicans in order to do the right thing here. Now, the gunman allegedly committed this act of terrorism in order to make Jodie Foster fall in love with him, and as such was able to avoid execution on plea of insanity. This, of course, made right-wingers exceptionally butthurt, and so the Insanity Defense Reform Act was passed a few years after the incident, which shifted the burden of proof when it came to determining the legal threshold for insanity, and is the reason why the insanity defense really isn't viable anymore. Now, I want to be crystal clear. I would never condone any form of political violence on YouTube, and John was legitimately unwell, but according to his doctors, he's no longer a threat to himself or to others. That being said, it appears as if Hinckley is still under probation, even though it ostensibly ended in March of 2018. Free John Hickenlooper. Wait, what was I talking about here again? Oh, right. If anyone in the comments can explain what Milo's joke here was supposed to be about, that'd be greatly appreciated. Although, maybe I'm just reading too much into this scene because, like much of the dialogue in the movie, it's probably supposed to come off as a little stilted and awkward.
I remember it felt awkward to me.
Really?
And I remember saying to Brian, boy, that felt awkward. He says, that's good because it's supposed to be awkward.
Did he want people to feel awkward in doing what they were doing?
He did. And I totally understand that now.
Which sort of lends to this film's general feeling of unease. We then cut to a scene of Billy's sister, Jenny, getting dressed, and, I can't help but feel from the way the scene is presented that we're supposed to ogle her. And, yeesh, she's supposed to be like a 16-year-old high school or something, for Christ's sake?
Chris Hansen here, Hansen vs. Predators, to enter Predator, and have a seat with Chris Hansen. But the boy with usually transcripts.
Blanchard, who we'll later discover is a recently dumped ex-boyfriend, comes out of the closet and grabs Jenny, but her brother intervenes, grabbing the creep and throwing him out of the house, just as the parents are coming home from, you know what, I'm not exactly sure what the parents are supposed to do for a living, and you know what, I don't remember it actually being in the film at all. I guess the dad might be a lawyer, as there's a scene later where he's discussing paperwork with a judge.
I think what you'll find in paragraph 10 will excite you.
Although it's also possible that they just live off of some sort of inheritance and do whatever they want, as most wealth in the United States is inherited and not earned. Speaking of dads, my fellow nerds might recognize the father character James Whitney, played by Charles Lucia, as Ambassador Ves Alcar from Season 6, Episode 3 of Star Trek The Next Generation. Hold on, is anyone else getting a strange sense of deja vu? Deja vu? Anyway, the mother and father characters here seem a little too chill about Blanchard, but as we'll find out by the end, there is a reason for this. In fact, when I first watched Society, there was a lot of scenes with elements that seemed a little creepy and ominous, but in that way you can't quite put your finger on. But as I rewatched the movie for the review, I noticed a lot of subtle looks and micro expressions that make more sense within the context of what happens later. And that rewatchability is something Society really has going for it over your average Hollywood production. After the parents leave the scene, the kids start talking about Jenny's coming out party.
I'm gay, Daddy! I'm gay!
No, not like that. This coming out event is also known as a debutante ball. And if you're still unfamiliar with the concept, man, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you ain't rich. But hey, as a fellow member of the working poor, let me give you the straight dope. A debutante ball is a formal gathering of rich people in anachronistic and expensive cosplay where they parade their daughters, or debutantes, in front of their rich friends' thirsty incel spawn in an attempt to keep their children, and by extension the wealth, privilege, and cultural knowledge they will inherit, sequestered within a small, carefully curated group. It's basically the same kind of cynical and harmful political marriages that have been going on for millennia. After another bitchin' bit of practical effects work, we cut to a debate for student body president, which was, funnily enough, shot at Birmingham High School, which was where actor Billy Warlock graduated some 10 years prior. Not only that, but one of the writers actually grew up in Beverly Hills, and supposedly many of the characters are based on people he knew in real life, which really gives the piece a sense of authenticity, or, I mean, at least I'm assuming, as my net worth isn't high enough to allow access into Beverly Hills.
I don't stand a chance. It's something that you're born into.
During the debate, Billy is distracted by a fiery hot Latina in a scene reminiscent of Basic Instinct, a movie that was filmed after Society, but due to some fuckery, the two movies actually ended up coming out the same year here in the States. I think as a lefty, I'm contractually obligated to mention the controversy surrounding Basic Instinct, so let me just say for the record, while Sharon Stone was understandably and justifiably upset that her vag was seen so clearly on the big screen, ultimately, I think it's kind of weird that, as a society, people get embarrassed by having their genitals exposed, and you know what? It's time for humanity to be free. You know what? For far too long have our ding-dongs and ho-hos been shackled by the oppressive restraints of the blue jeansies. Fuckers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our shit. Also, isn't it kind of weird that while being distracted by the coochie, Billy argues for a more strict dress code? I mean, you'd think that technique would have the opposite effect. Whatever, before we move on, I'd just like to say that the debate opponent, Petrie here, has excellent taste in glasses, and also shares his name with the Pterodon character in The Land Before Time, released a year prior to filming. Coincidence? Yeah, probably. But back to the plot, and things seem to be calming down a little. Maybe all that weird shit that's been happening is just in Billy's head? At this point, it's unclear.
They don't approve of me, okay? They don't accept my friends.
They don't talk to me like they do Jenny. Hell, they don't even look like me. I think I was adopted.
The sense of alienation from your family, feeling like you were adopted, is something I can personally relate to. But the interesting thing is that this is actually something of a recent phenomenon due to a number of complex socioeconomic factors, such as institutional age segregation and advertising agencies targeting increasingly narrow demographics. And look, I'm not going to bore you with all the nitty-gritty details in this video, but it's an interesting thing to research if you've got the time. The next scene has Billy looking for some sunscreen. Fucking honkies, am I right? This is a joke. All people benefit from the use of sunscreen and no one is too dark to get skin cancer. And see something peculiar behind the frosted glass door of the shower.
Spotted her more than once. Ass so fat that you can see it from the front.
Now, I'm not crazy about discussing this, but incest is a running theme of the movie, so buckle up.
To boldly go where no one has gone before.
It seems to me that the purpose of these references are usually to elicit fear, revulsion, laughter, or maybe some combination of these reactions. Although there might be an element of social commentary in here as well. You see, the ruling class have historically engaged in tons of incest, but this accurate, if unflattering depiction of the rich and powerful can understandably make an audience feel a little uncomfortable. Game of Thrones, anyone? Now, this is just my personal opinion, but I think the reason why these aberrant desires are so common among the wealthy is that their relative level of power makes them so far removed from humanity that there are very few people outside of their direct relatives who can truly relate to them on an emotional level. But, I mean, I'm no psychologist, so let's move on. Oh, and I should mention that this interpretation isn't exactly supported by the director, as in Yuzna's commentary for the film, he states that...
And one of the things that I sort of also try to bring out in the script and in the staging, in developing it, was sort of an incest theme, which I think is kind of something that's at the basis of a lot of horror movies, maybe most of them.
I don't know about all that, man, but luckily, I believe in the death of the author, so Yuzna's opinion on how his work should be interpreted isn't necessarily the definitive, de facto, correct way to interpret it. But regardless, the familial love scenes, and there's a fair amount of them in here, play into one of the two major types of horror that this movie is going for. The aforementioned paranoia and body horror. Now, just in case you're new to the term, and there's nothing wrong with that, body horror is a type of fear invoked by violations of the human body, manifested with a depiction of aberrant sex, mutations, or unnatural movements of the human body. And I think the running incestuous implications of society is definitely one of the ways the film tries to evoke this body horror, specifically with, the aberrant sex angle. Now brace yourselves, as there's some more problematic implementations of this aberrant sex theme that'll come up later, so I just want you to keep this definition in mind. After Billy gets the sunscreen and an eye full of sis, he goes with his cheerleader girlfriend to the Albacore Club, which is a private beach country club? I'm not really sure, but regardless, its name is likely a reference to the 1974 film Chinatown, which also featured an Albacore Club. Billy wants to smash, but the girlfriend seems to be mostly uninterested and is instead trying to leverage his family status to get an invite to Ted Ferguson's party. But this conflict is interrupted by a couple of rowdy kids. Both the girlfriend and later Billy get lotion squirted on their face in a manner that my Coomer brain can only interpret one way.
Hey, you Nathan, God damn it, my hair!
In fact, teenage sexuality is a kind of a core theme of this movie, and now that I think about it, it seems to be a core theme in a lot of horror films.
Maybe most of them.
Anyway, as Billy goes to ask for an invite, he stumbles into probably my least favorite character in this whole movie, but, more on her later. As Billy approaches Ferguson and his posse, what follows is a scene that's frankly uncomfortable to watch, a cringy social dynamic that really could only exist in high school.
So, you know of anything that's going on this week?
This week? I can't think of anything.
After face-planting hard, Billy is approached by Blanchard. Now, Billy is still rightly pissed off, but agrees to listen to some tapes Blanchard has, which seem to imply that Ginny fucked her mom, dad, and Ted Ferguson, among others.
You know the schedule. First we dine, then copulation. With someone your own age first. Then with your mother and me.
But, hey, it's just audio, and maybe there's some kind of mistake, or maybe Billy's just, kind of imagining things. Regardless, this has Billy angry and confused, so he smacks Blanchard around some and steals one of the tapes before running off. And I guess he took the scenic route, because it appears to be quite late at night when he gets to Dr. Cleveland's house, but he's still wearing his beach gear. Possible continuity errors aside, I'm a little disappointed with this scene as I find it a little strange that Billy, who is suspicious of his family and his psychiatrist, would hand over these tapes. I suppose the implication here is that he's desperate to prove to his shrink that his paranoia is in some way justified, but if that's the case, it really could have been done better by demonstrating this tendency more consistently earlier on. The next day, Billy is accosted by Shauna. Shauna! This is actually the first time she's mentioned by name, and I'm not gonna lie, I kinda hate her character. Nothing against the actor Heidi Kozak, who played this airhead Valley Girl type extremely well. I just hate to see this kind of desperate social ambition in a person, all the more so when it's from someone who presumably was already born to wealth and power. I don't know, it just kind of strikes me as slimy, and honestly, I'm a little disappointed her character doesn't get killed. Not saying people like that deserve to die, obviously, but with this being a horror movie and all, it kind of makes sense, right? But seriously, though, hats off to cast and crew. She's a character you love to hate.
The girlfriend is such a shallow high school bitch.
Anyway, it seems as if Billy might share some of my sentiments, and after a brief argument, Shauna walks off in a huff. Now, I don't want to break my arm jerking him off, but I was really impressed by the acting from Evan Richards here. As he approaches, you can just tell from his expression that he was the one who put the shrunken head in the locker, and is anticipating Billy to laugh at the prank or show some other reaction, but Billy seems distant. In the next scene, Cleveland is angry with Billy, and somewhat understandably given that recording people without their consent in California is a serious crime. But in his brief tirade, he yells out some stuff that I can only read as particularly ominous social commentary.
Now, some people make the rules, and some people follow the rules. It's a question of what you're born to.
He then threatens to drug his patient up, and while, again, I think that this is intentional, for the record, this is not how mental health professionals act. Look, I'm not sure who needs to hear this, but there was a time in my own life that I needed to hear it, so here you go, paying it forward. It can be a challenging experience to talk to a therapist, but I can say from experience that you will never regret seeking help, even if ultimately you don't need it. If you're struggling, there's no reason to feel awkward or afraid about talking about it, and it's okay to get professional help. You deserve it. Sorry about the PSA, I'll get off my soapbox now. That's my secret, Cap. I'm always on my soapbox. Anyhow, Billy is convinced that there's been some sort of mistake and arranges to meet Blanchard and get a backup tape. Oh, and real quick while we're on this scene, why does Dr. Cleveland have a big-ass bowl of celery and carrots on his desk? Are those supposed to be for him, or the patients, or both? I don't know, it just seems strange to me. Billy races up to meet Blanchard, but there's been a brutal car accident, and even though he ruins his sweet kicks, Billy can't find the tapes. While this is probably the most suspicious event yet, it's still within the realm of coincidence. And after getting kicked off of the scene of the accident by Bizarro World Cop...
I mean, we all know that cops in real life are way more aggro than this, right?
Billy returns home to find that he's been invited to Ferguson's party after all.
Wow!
Wow! Maybe to blow off some steam, or maybe because he's searching for answers, Billy ends up deciding to go to the party by himself, without Shauna. And I just gotta say, for the record, the rich can't party like the poor. Look, it's a fact. A rowdy party exists to give you an escape from your daily life, and the wealthy just don't need that, at least not in the way the lower class does. Anyway, at the boring party, Billy locks eyes with... whoa... Clarissa Carlisle. Character of Clarissa was played by Devin DeVasquez, who was Playboy's Playmate of the Month for the month of June 1985. Clarissa is one of my favorite characters in the movie. Not only is she smoking hot, confident, and quick-witted, but also I think she plays a valuable role in the critique society makes of society. That's not going to get confusing. Anyway, I'll talk more about my feelings on her character near the end of the review. While Billy is dancing with Clarissa, Milo shows up with a shirt that says "Eat the Rich." And he and Clarissa trade some 80s insults that, frankly, haven't aged well.
Whatever turns you on.
At least I don't turn tricks to get my kicks.
Milo wants to talk to Billy about what happened to Blanchard, but Billy is too distraught to deal with that, so he leaves his best bro and follows Clarissa into the cool kids tent. Is that a joint? Hey, maybe this Ferguson guy ain't all bad.
Then I fucked your sister, and then everybody else got so turned on, they fucked her too. And as far as Big Ol' Breath Blanchard goes, I ran that low-rent fool right into a pole.
Whoa, that escalated quickly. Although the movie frames this as possibly just him fucking with Billy, and because I've already seen the ending, I can safely say that Ferguson isn't telling the whole truth here. And is it just me, or is there a little sexual tension in this scene? I don't know, maybe I'm just projecting here.
It's so intense.
The guys get into a scrap here, but due to the interference of his minions, Ferguson publicly embarrasses Billy yet again. Well, I mean, at least by 80s standards.
Make waves, sweetie. You're gonna drown.
After getting thrown into the pool, Billy gets consoled by Clarissa, who offers to take him inside for a change of clothes. Oh yeah, alright, they bout to fuck. Oh god, oh god, oh god, oh god, oh god. The tension between desire and revulsion, between what is real and what is imagined, is reinforced in the way that, for a moment anyway, it appears as if Clarissa's body is contorted in the same manner his sister's was. But hey, like I've always said, if you can look your partner or partners in the eye the next morning, you're doing something wrong.
How do you like your tea? Cream? Sugar? Or do you want me to pee in it?
I mentioned earlier that Clarissa's mom, Miss Carlisle here, is probably my least favorite character in the movie, and I think it's now as good a time as any to discuss why. I just don't get her purpose in the film. In fact, as far as I can tell, she's just kind of like a running fat joke with a random compulsion to eat hair. In fact, the hair thing comes up multiple times, which has always confused me, but at least I'm not the only one.
And this business with her mother, it's straight out of the script. I certainly talked with Woody a lot about it. And all this business about eating hair and stuff has always sort of baffled me.
This line here
Has that brain of yours finally gone completely numb?
is basically the only indication we have of what her deal is. And even still, that's not much to go on. Although on repeat viewing and with the benefit of director's commentary, it appears as if her condition is the result of the same sinister forces at play in Billy's life. There's also no mention of a father, so presumably Clarissa just runs the house herself. I guess that kind of explains her independent nature and the frustration she feels in dealing with her mom, but she's still kind of a raging asshole to a clearly impaired person, and, you know, I would be more mad at her, but that bush dough. The next day, Shauna confronts Billy over her suspicions of infidelity. Oh, shit, she's got a ring? Yikes, Billy. I mean, I was on your side until this point, and look, don't get me wrong, not just in terms of appearance, but in terms of personality. Clarissa is clearly the superior choice. But still, dude, come on, why'd you have to give her a ring? I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be an engagement ring necessarily, but still, dude, don't be a douchebag. Sorry, just hold on, I just gotta pour one out for all the homies who had to fuck sex dolls like this in the 80s. Billy storms in, thinking his family pulled the blow-up doll prank on him, and while it could still all be in his head, the actions of his family are starting to strain credulity, as this scene right here is awfully sexual for a normal family. I mean, I don't exactly have a normal family, though, so I don't know. You tell me.
Fuck you, butthead.
After yelling a few insults at his parents, we cut to Billy, with his friend Milo, approaching the open casket at Blanchard's funeral. Now, maybe I haven't been watching the right shit, but I think this might actually have been the first Jewish funeral I've ever seen in a movie. Now, I'm not religious myself, and have never attended a Jewish funeral, so I did a little bit of research, and apparently the members of the Jewish faith don't typically have a viewing of the body, nor are they buried in caskets unless required by local law. California law doesn't require caskets for funeral, by the way, so this could be seen as a mistake on the part of the filmmakers. In fact, I've even seen a review online implying that this error is anti-Semitic in nature. But here's my more charitable interpretation. As we find out later, this isn't actually Blanchard's body, so presumably this funeral was coordinated by the mysterious and sinister forces beyond Billy's awareness. Meaning that Yuzna and crew knew that this ceremony wasn't accurate to the Jewish tradition, but chose to include this scene, like, with the stilted dialogue and references to incest, in order to add a sense of unease that something isn't quite right. Now, this interpretation of the scene is also mildly supported by the director's commentary.
Of course, we just sort of added the little detail that he was Jewish in his funeral, his fake funeral, just to sort of like throw that one in there too, just mix it in the stew. Which isn't to say that conceptually that the Jews wouldn't have also their society, and so would the African tribes, and so would the Ming Dynasty. The idea is it's not a racial thing. It's deeper than that.
Which seems to imply that they chose this direction to throw the anti-Semites off the trail, which, considering the way that They Live was received a year earlier, was probably smart thinking on their part, although it clearly wasn't enough. Anyway, at the funeral, Petrie claims to have some info that'll make everything make sense, but wants to meet in a secure and secluded location in the woods. But when Billy gets there, it appears as if Petrie's throat has been slit. Damn, wait a minute. Hold on. Everyone who is about to spoil the ending of this movie gets killed. better be careful. Billy has a brief confrontation with a mysterious stranger, but is thrown aside, presumably because they're the only ones he thinks he can trust. Billy grabs Clarissa and some cops to follow him to the scene of the crime. But would you know it, it's just an abandoned car. What the hell is going on?
Oh, and because ACAB, the Joe Rogan-looking motherfucker, feels up Clarissa, and the other cop directly threatens a high schooler.
Next time I see you, it'll be a lot less pleasant.
Stay classy, pigs.
After the Oinkers leave, something truly bizarre happens. Look, I can understand why Billy might not want to go home. He's clearly spooked by them, but why the actual fuck does he stay the night with Clarissa in his Jeep, which is completely exposed deep in the secluded woods where he thinks a murder just happened? Whatever. There's a second debate scheduled the next morning, and when Petrie is late, Billy yells about how he saw him dead in the woods last night, right as Petrie walks on stage.
Would someone like to tell me what's going on here?
Jesus, Billy just can't catch a break, can he? But as it turns out, Milo, worried about his bro Billy, followed him from the funeral and provides independent confirmation that something fishy really is going on. And man, can I just say, I really love Milo. And then this is just really a touching bromance scene. I just wish that when this conversation was done, the two of them would have stuck together, buddy cop style, instead of splitting the party when they can both tell something serious is about to go down. Come on, man, that's rule one. You never split the party.
We'd better split up and look for clues.
Now, one of the things that elevates this indie horror flick from its more schlocky peers is how long it teases its central conceit and sticks to the possibility that this is all in Billy's head. It's not until about halfway in do things seem legitimately weird, and it's not until about the final half hour or so that we have any real confirmation about what the fuck is going on. Take this scene about an hour or so in, where Billy attempts to confront his parents, and it appears as if they've been waiting to stage some kind of intervention for him. Now, Billy starts yelling about his rights.
You don't have any rights.
Before being rendered unconscious by Dr. Cleveland and thrown in the hospital.
You know how I hate to give you drugs.
Again, like the absolute bro he is, Milo was watching Billy's six and tries to get him out of the hospital, but unfortunately, Billy is dead.
No, 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 no!
Frustrated and confused, Milo goes to the parking lot to discover someone has parked Billy's car in the handicap spot. Which would have been an asshole move, but Milo parked his Beamer in the handicap spot next to him too, so, what are you gonna do? And something I missed in the first viewing is this medical chart that lists colorectostomy, high enema, and NPO, which means the patient is allowed food or drink, which is clearly a method to completely clean out his digestive tract, which will make a lot more sense here in a bit. By the way, the Thorazine on the chart here is an anti-anxiety medication which can help people suffering from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or just generally people freaking out before going into surgery. It can also help to reduce aggression and minimize hallucinations. I find it kind of an interesting Easter egg. Wake up. Now, this scene was originally going to be in the beginning of the movie, with everything we've seen up to this point been told in flashbacks, but the filmmakers felt that they needed to simplify the structure of the narrative a bit to the more linear form that we have in the finished version, which I don't know if I agree with, but there you go. Fun little bit of trivia for you. The hospital here is the same one from Halloween 2, the original 1981 version of Halloween 2 and not the 2009 version, obviously. Not only that, but Billy Warlock's father is the guy who played that version of Michael Myers. Oh, and do you guys remember how earlier I said Billy Warlock, which I just gotta say is one of the most badass names I've ever heard. His dad's name is Dick Warlock. 100% reason to remember the name. Billy, clearly still a little loopy from the drugs, speeds off, leaving his best bro for Clarissa again.
Bros before hoes.
He aggressively confronts Clarissa, choking her, and I know that some people would understandably be upset by the social and power dynamics of the scene rather than the practical techniques, but as a sometimes martial artist and an all-the-time dom, I gotta be real, I'm a little triggered by the way Billy is choking Clarissa here.
What a choker, the trick is in the wrist. It is all in the wrist.
All joking aside, I'm a little upset that Billy didn't team up with Milo here instead of Clarissa, but as we'll find out soon, Billy probably made the right call. Besides, Milo is busy struggling with Clarissa's mother anyway, who still seems to be little more than a bizarre running fat joke. Though, I gotta say, I really do like her hair. Like aesthetically, not like to eat. Everything comes full circle as we find ourselves with a scene that mirrors the first, and as I said before, the previous version of this scene might lessen the impact here a bit, but on the other hand, it changes up enough things to kind of play with your expectations a little bit, so I'm not going to fault it too hard. You know what, we're going to pause here as we're about to get to the reason why most people remember or talk about this movie, because love it or hate it, the last 15 to 20 minutes of the film is what really defines it. I know I mentioned spoilers earlier, but seeing how part of the appeal of this film is its shocking finale, here's your final warning.
Massive fucking spoilers ahead, bucko.
The lights come on and Billy is grabbed by men in tuxedos and, hold on a minute, is that an upstanding officer of the law engaging in violence against an unarmed civilian in order to protect the interests of the property-owning landed gentry class? This is my surprised face. But for serious, this scene is very well constructed. The smiling, giggling nature of society as they're all dressed up in their fanciest clothes, paired with the classical music playing in the background, it all works together really well for a specific kind of creep factor that's kind of hard to define, really. Let me see if I can kind of explain it by example. Like, imagine, and okay, I know this is a bit of a stretch here, but bear with me. Imagine there's some kind of, I don't know, secret society made up of the wealthiest and most powerful of the world. You know, the ones who actually run the world, that make the laws which govern our behavior and run all of our institutions. Imagine that while preaching decency, civility, and respectability, they were preying on the flesh of children. Wouldn't that be weird? Wouldn't that be fucked up? There's a theory about supernatural and or fantastic horror films that the horrors depicted are based, at least in some sense, on real, if often unspoken, anxieties. The movie society is anything but subtle, so I can say with full confidence that the underlying anxieties of the film are that bougie fucks are, on a fundamental level, just not like us, and that the perverse desires they have are almost alien to the human experience, that they have an inordinate amount of control over our personal and professional lives, and that, at least in a metaphorical sense, suck us dry. Man, I sure do love fiction. But all joking aside, what I like about this big reveal is that in a broader sense, it plays off the understanding that beneath the surface, most of our institutions are corrupt and just plain don't work in the interest of the majority. This is an awakening that many of us have had as an adolescent, but unfortunately many others will never grasp. Or, well, maybe perhaps they do, but deny it, as accepting this bitter truth to be truly red-pilled, if you will, is a truth too horrifying to accept. Finally, after nearly 80 minutes of twisting and turning, we finally come to the infamous shunting scene. Bit of context for you here. A shunt is a medical term that describes a small passage that allows the movement of fluids from one part of the body to the other. And ooh boy, is it probably the most technically accurate, if blithe, way to describe this twisted event. Oh, and bonus points for sounding a little bit like cunt, which is just truly an exquisite word. The shunting scenes were filmed in a single day over the course of 17 hours at GMT Studios in Culver City, California. Now this was too hilarious not to include. GMT stands for Great and Mighty Things, a reference to Jeremiah 33:3, and was founded by the far-right Christian, big surprise there, dipshit Alan Haig in 1985 in order to make the obscure satanic panic Christian propaganda flick Force of Darkness. Apparently, when management found out what was being filmed, they gave the cast and crew a very wide berth. And like the absolute G unit he is, Brian Big Dick Usna hung a sign on the soundstage that read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," a reference to Dante's Inferno, an interesting, if misunderstood, bit of political satire. From all the interviews, convention appearances, etc. I've seen, Usna seems to be just a genuinely good-humored guy, and despite how disturbing this sequence is, all the interviews with the cast and crew I've been able to get my hands on seems to indicate that everyone just had a blast filming it. Except for maybe Billy Warlock, who had the fucking choker pole on him. Oh, and while we're talking about GMT Studios, this was also the location for Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit music video. This bizarre, writhing mash of flesh and goop was apparently inspired by some creepy Salvador Dali paintings, such as The Great Masturbator, Autumn Cannibalism, and, god damn it, Dali, could you not have picked a shorter name? Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War. I've also heard rumors that nightmares the director had about flesh melting into flesh contributed to this effect. And hoo boy, is it a hell of an effect. According to the director's commentary, it took about 14 people to operate the shunt puppet, and a ridiculous amount of methylcellulose-based goop, which, fun fact, is the same chemical compound found in fiber supplements. And can we just take a fucking second to acknowledge the absolute fucking legend responsible for all the surrealist makeup design and creation? Screaming Mad George. I've been holding off talking about this guy until now, but I gotta say, I think I'm in love with SMG. I don't know if it's the hair, the love of creepy shit, or the fact that we both chose new, better names for ourselves or what, but I really do feel a certain kinship with the man, and, I'd really love to meet him someday and pick his brain. In a strictly metaphorical sense, of course. In researching the production process for this film, I ran into one of Screaming Mad George's quotes that I just have to share with you. I don't really like violence, but I like created violence. You can enjoy fake violence even if it's a really, really horrible thing. But I don't like violence when it's real. I don't like anything that's real. Which I find fascinating. Now, you might expect people who devote their lives to the macabre, the writers, musicians, and visual artists who deal with the dark and twisted to be fucked up and violent themselves, either corrupted by their work or somehow innately fucked up. But contrary to popular belief, people who adopt a particularly gruesome, morbid, or violent angle to their work are more often than not some of the softest and most loving people on the inside. Take Juggalos, aka fans of the Insane Clown Posse, a rap group who are notorious for their brutally violent lyrics, and they are unironically some of the sweetest and most giving people you will meet in your goddamn life. In a similar manner, those who create and consume horror are some of the most open, inclusive, and supporting people alive. By contrast, I find it rather peculiar that those who devote their lives to righteousness, purity, and conformity, who drape themselves in the aesthetics of cleanliness, whiteness, and light, are almost always among the most hateful and bigoted among us. Y'all motherfuckers need Satan. But you might be wondering, what is the appeal of these macabre subcultures to sensitive and caring people? Well, personally, I think it's because reality is harsh, brutal, and unfair. In truth, there is no closure, no satisfying end to any life. That the absurdities and contradictions we suffer in our shared experience makes temporary escape to the transcendence of fiction not merely understandable, but I would argue sometimes necessary. Furthermore, when we use the relief of narrative to confront the darker sides of human nature in the safe and consequence-free medium of fantasy, we make the fleeting moments of hope, joy, and love in our lives all the more meaningful. Okay, Jesus, this is getting way off track here. Let's just take a second. Deep breath, and jump back into the review. While this finale has some amazing practical effects, especially given the temporal and budgetary constraints, I've got a couple of criticisms, both relatively minor. For one, there's a brief scene where the body horror is grounded, at least partially, in the fear of gender nonconformity, and in a modern context, the horror of cross-dressing seems a little tone-deaf. But while we're on the topic of the LGBT community, I've seen some people online insinuate the film has a twinge of homophobia in this scene.
And now, we'll get to the bottom.
Oh, God.
Of this.
But I think that interpretation might be a little uncharitable. You see, while the two principal actors in the scene are both male, the true horror of this scene stems from the violent and predatory nature of this kind of primal violation. Or, more directly, what Carter and the rest of society is doing to Blanchard is a form of rape. This is particularly disturbing, and apparently in the editing room, Yuzna, along with the assistant editors, had to cut a lot of the footage from this scene because it was frankly just too intense and disturbing for the tone of the film. My second and more substantive criticism of the shunting is the harsh red glow on set. It feels kind of like stage play lighting, and if I was in charge, I would have gone for something closer to the low frame and lighting of the opening credits over this style, as it would have given the whole affair a more sickly feeling. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if you're watching the remaster and you're particularly eagle-eyed, you may be able to spot the seams on some of the masks and some other minor errors of the practical effects, although, to be fair, they're relatively minor and would undoubtedly been unnoticeable in the VHS tapes and television sets at the time.
I'm getting too old for this.
In the original script, the climax here was more in line with traditional horror tropes. The eponymous society was going to be a religious cult, and the shunting would have been more of a bloody sacrificial ritual. But the creators of the film wanted to do something a little more surreal, and I gotta say, the switch was a damn good choice. There's already a ton of satanic panic bullshit out there, and I think this kind of social critique through horror is particularly effective. Not only that, but this more abstract body horror scene was useful from another perspective, as it would have been hard enough to get approval from the notoriously censorious conservatives of the Motion Picture Association of America without explicit depictions of blood and gore. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, however, the pearl clutchers at the MPAA still required 4 minutes to be cut from the theater release, although if you catch the remastered version, it is entirely uncut. kind of like my... Billy escapes from the orgiastic violence to a room upstairs where he finds a potentially more disturbing scene.
If you have any edible fantasies you'd like to indulge in, Billy, now's the time.
Yes, even among society, it appears as if Billy's adopted family is particularly incestuous and perverse. And you might be wondering here, do they want to fuck him or eat him? Yes, the stop-motion puppetry of this scene, it was unquestionably ambitious, but it's also the effect that has aged the most poorly. Stop-motion has largely been abandoned by filmmakers, as it's extremely difficult to maintain the illusion of fluid movement that can now be more easily achieved through other means such as CGI, although that wasn't available at the time, of course. We get a shitty pun here that nevertheless still gets a chuckle out of me.
I guess you're right. I am a butthead.
Hold on, is describing this gag as a shitty pun in a shitty pun? Wait, pun. Billy flees from the master bedroom and we're treated to a final view of the shunting, and I gotta say, once again, these are some really amazing practical effects. But the surreal nature, mixed with the lower disgust response typical of people on the left, means that in a weird way, the film is actually more effective, as a horror movie at least, for people who would disagree with its basic premise. In fact, despite the tone of paranoia and suspicion in the beginning, left-leaning Usna only begrudgingly considers it a horror flick.
I guess ultimately you'd have to call this a horror movie, but I'm a big horror fan, and I really don't think of it as a horror movie, but I don't know where you'd put it otherwise.
And I'd have to agree. While it certainly borrows heavily from the horror tradition, I don't get the impression that scaring the audience is the real point. Now, I might have jumped the gun earlier, but I think it's here that we have peak gay tension. And it's impossible to discuss the ways you could interpret the depictions of homosexuality here as decadent or predatory without mentioning the AIDS crisis of the Reagan administration, as society was filmed at arguably the peak of that social and moral panic.
President Reagan came to Philadelphia planning to address the AIDS epidemic. He was still at the airport when he was asked what school children should be taught about AIDS.
I think that abstinence has been lacking in much of the education. One of the things that's been wrong with too much of our education is that no kind of values of right and wrong are being taught.
Please kill yourself.
As an American, it's really kind of impossible not to draw some lines of comparison between the AIDS crisis and the current coronavirus pandemic. Both Reagan and Trump downplayed the severity of the outbreak and fought against taking any sort of action as long as they could. Due to their evil and irresponsible procrastination, they caused the unnecessary death and suffering of millions. Both spread information and contributed to a climate of fear and helped draw out some of the worst of people's biases and prejudices. There's also some important differences, of course, as AIDS was portrayed as just desserts and was gleefully cheered on by bigots who were excited to see it affecting primarily what they would consider undesirables in society. And to this day, the Catholic Church does all it can to spread the disease in African countries as part of their irrational war on prophylactics. Okay, we have to get off this topic because it's making me too angry.
I leave you with 4 words. I'm glad Reagan dead.
As I alluded to earlier, you can read a little bit of homophobia into this scene, and while it does make sense in the context of the times, I would argue that this homosexual anxiety, specifically the fear of being penetrated, is subverted by Billy going all the way up Ferguson's bunghole and turning him inside out. I'm by no means the arbiter of the correct interpretation of this film, so please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I might even join in on the conversation if you've got an interesting enough take. With this climactic 1v1 final destination, no items fight complete, Clarissa has to make an important decision, and this choice will be the basis of my analysis, or should I say analysis, of what her character represents. You see, while she might have contributed to this elaborate prank on Billy, ultimately she chooses the side of the oppressed underclass, showing us that these creatures don't have to be parasites. In fact, it would appear as if they're more than capable of living normal lives, yet choose to exploit innocent victims for fun and or profit. Taking it back to the real world for a second, I think this can sort of metaphorically anyway, show us that people who are born into wealth and privilege are capable of transcending their own personal narrow self-interest and join the working class in overthrowing our oppressors. While he's certainly not without his flaws, I'm reminded of Nathan J. Robinson in this moment. Not just because he's also totally fuckable,
What are you buying?
but because he was born to privilege, graduated from Harvard and Yale, and yet argues for the emancipation of the working class. Now, one of the biggest flaws of Society is that after it blows its load on the shunting, the movie soon ends abruptly and without any real closure. Now, I do like how in the end, Billy doesn't really win, and while you could argue that its open-ended nature is meant to be optimistic, as it allows you to fill in the blanks however you want, if that's what the creators were really going for, I think they would have made Billy's victory more definitive. In fact, the way I look at it, Billy and his two allies are ultimately doomed, as Society seems to be a national, if not international, conspiracy that doesn't react to the escape of their prey with fear or anger.
Well, Dr. Cleveland, it looks as though I may have an opening in Washington next summer. Know what I mean?
And I think this is because Billy and the gang are ultimately powerless to be free or to spark any sort of systemic change. But love it or hate it, the ending leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Some of these questions were addressed in the comic sequel published by Rough Cut Comics in 2003, albeit in a rather unsatisfying way. Now, info on this shit is hella sparse, and I ain't paying real money for the comic, but I'm nothing if not overly thorough though, so if you're curious as to how it went, here goes. We pick up 10 years later, and Billy and the gang are attempting to hunt down members of Society and expose their exploits online. Meanwhile, Society's trying to capture them to cure some sort of genetic bottlenecking that's been happening. This is hinted at a little in the movie and is made more clear in the director's commentary. Apparently, all the incest among the ruling class has created a lot of genetic issues, and so, in addition to whatever pleasure or nourishment they would receive from, raping and sucking up the poor, they also incorporate new genetic material into their group. It's also revealed that Clarissa and Billy are half-siblings, so that's nice, at least for all you hentai and step fans. And apparently, at some point, Clarissa backslides on the whole class traitor thing, so clearly I'm not going to be happy with the direction they took this continuation of the story. And when you couple these narrative choices with this truly atrocious artwork, yeah, I'm sorry, no thanks, not interested, bud. Now, of course, like with a lot of cult classics, there's been talks of prequels and sequels, but as of yet, nothing concrete has happened, and while it's certainly not impossible, it seems rather unlikely that we'll ever see more of this universe explored. Alright, so that was Society, but before I wrap it up with my overall thoughts and rating, I thought it would be fun if we take a look at how this movie has been received over the years. Society was originally released in 1989, but we didn't get to see it over here in the land of the free until 3 years later, presumably because of uptight Karens working in the film distribution at the time, but who knows. I know this is going to sound extremely pretentious, but I think a lot of people don't get Society. You see, early on in researching for this review, I found that among both critics and general audiences, Society was received rather poorly, at least here in the United States. Now, you can probably already tell my feelings towards this movie are more positive than most, but for the sake of fairness and to broaden my own perspective, I consumed every review of the film I could find online, from newspapers to review aggregators, from independent horror fan sites to YouTube videos and even podcasts. While there are certainly a lot of legitimate criticisms that can be levied against Society, and of course your enjoyment of any media is to a certain extent going to be subjective, I wanted to give you the other side of the story, and in that effort, I was able to synthesize the criticisms of the piece into three main categories, which I'll address in descending order of legitimacy, from what I believe to be the most valid complaints to the least.
Number 1, it's gross.
That's kind of the point. You don't have to like the horror genre or body horror in specific, but to criticize a movie for accomplishing one of its primary genre goals strikes me as kind of a bullshit standard to hold a movie to. But whatever, like I said, everyone has their own tastes, and I can certainly see how, particularly with the incest stuff, that this movie can turn some audiences off.
Number 2, it's poorly acted.
I wholeheartedly disagree. Of course, as an indie horror film, it was never going to win any Oscars, but as I showed earlier, there's some really good performances to be found in Society, and personally, I find that kind of hyper-polished, overproduced, Sorkin-esque, snappy banter horseshit, that's common in many mainstream releases, to be completely unbelievable and disengaging. 0 out of 10, ruined my immersion, literally unwatchable. Additionally, as I referenced earlier, the dialogue was supposed to come off as awkward and stilted. And while you're absolutely free to disagree with this artistic decision, don't make the mistake of a lot of these professional review schmucks and blame it on mere incompetence.
Number 3, its political message.
I find the people who get upset by the political messaging of the film fall into one of two camps. One, people who are ignorant of class and thus are understandably confused as to the point the film was trying to make, and two, people who get the political message but were upset by it because they disagree. The first category was by far the largest, and nested under that umbrella of confusion lies my favorite hot take of society. Actually, it's a critique of communism. Seriously, what the actual fuck? I honestly can't understand how anyone can read that into this movie. In fact, in the fucking mask portion, Dr. Cleveland looks straight into the camera and directly explains the thesis of the film to the audience.
You're a different race from us, a different species, a different class.
It's really, frankly, astounding how many people, especially here in the States, completely missed the explicitly Marxist nature of this film's core theme. To quote the director on why American audiences didn't resonate with the film as much as European audiences, "We have this fantasy of the American dream that if you work hard, you'll succeed and become rich. You're not supposed to resent what the rich have, because if you work hard, you can get it." Now, of course, there was also the smaller group, the people who understood the political messaging but disagreed, and all of them essentially offered this as their scathing rebuttal. Nuh-uh. And that, for you, basically is, sort of the general reception, at least of the negative reviews that I was able to find online. I've been giving my opinions throughout this entire review, but let me give you a quick summary of the good and the bad before I give you the letter grade. The good. There's this weird, uncomfortable, and mysterious atmosphere that permeates the majority of this film, and the finality takes these amazing practical effects, disturbing imagery and ideas, and a solid critique of class, and blends it all together in this wild, raucous finale that really has to be seen to be believed. The bad. Society could have been a lot more subtle in its critique of class, and I really could have used with some more world building and character development personally, especially for the supporting cast. Additionally, as I said earlier, the ending felt rushed and a little anticlimactic. Now, if I was Brian Yuzna, and I'm not, I probably would have stuck with the original structure, where Billy is escaping from the hospital, but still added in the scenes with the shrink and, I don't know, maybe added in 15 to 20 minutes of additional footage, exploring some of the minor characters a little bit more, and maybe up the ante of the final scene a bit, giving us a more satisfying, if maybe less happy end. But judging a film against some sort of hypothetical, platonic ideal of how I would have made it, it ain't exactly fair, and ultimately, I had a great time watching this flick. Not just the first time around, but also in the second viewing. But if you're looking for my recommendation, I do think your potential enjoyment of the film depends on a few things. Do you like Cronenberg-style body horror? Can you overlook the minor continuity and narrative inconsistencies of a Wes Craven-style surrealist piece? And do you accept the legitimacy of a critique of our caste system? I think these are a few of the things to keep in mind if you're thinking about giving it a watch, but I'd personally recommend Society to just about anyone who isn't hyper-squeamish, and while there is a fair amount of gross-out scenes in it, I'd also say it's pretty tame compared to a lot of other horror movies in terms of just like explicit violence or disturbing imagery. But now, we're finally here to the moment of truth. And what's the letter grade? On a scale from S to F, I give Society a B. It's worth watching. With a higher budget and some minor tweaks here and there, this could have truly been one of the greatest films of all time. I really do believe that. But even still, I think it's a worthy entry to the canon of both body horror or paranoia, surrealist horror, and it really does have a surprisingly relevant political message, not just for Reagan's America, but for Trump's America too, I think. And I think that might actually be a good place to end this video, on the political messaging of the film. Now look, I know that times are tough. The stress of coronavirus and our oppressive police state have once again exposed some real deep-seated injustices inherent to our system that have been plaguing us for generations. And look, hey, if you're scared seeing America lurching ever closer to fascism as I am, maybe in some small sense, this film can help act as a wake-up call. Because it's time to acknowledge the fact that there really are two Americas, a rich America and a poor America, a free America and imprisoned America, an owning America and a working America. There's a class war, and if you are unaware that it took place, it's because you're on the side that lost. Now look, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to conflate racial and economic injustice here, and as these issues aren't identical, but they are related. And look, there's still a long road ahead of us on both fronts, but for those of us who want to see some positive change here, I think in a sense we are lucky, because once the powerless know the score, the powerful have only two options: to lie or to confess. And either way, they're going to be exposed as the monstrous parasites they truly are. While Billy and his friends may not have been able to bring any real systemic change to society, if we stick together, those of us in the real world still can, because at the end of the day, there's a whole hell of a lot more of us than there are of them.
It's time for guillotines. It's time for